There are plenty of dangerous jobs in the world, but ask most people, and they wouldn't say journalist is one of them. To be a good journalist, however, whether with a camera or a keyboard or paper and pencil, you have to expose yourself to people, ideas, events, and sometimes risk. You've probably heard of Wall Street Journal reporter Daniel Pearl and NBC's David Bloom. Pearl disappeared in January 2002. Bloom died in April 2003. In that 15-month period, around the world, 46 journalists died in the line of duty. They died trying to do their jobs. These are the stories of 6 extraordinary individuals, most of whom you probably never heard about, but they are men and women whose dedication and sacrifice you will not soon forget. We begin in January 2002. CBS Evening News anchor Dan Rather tells us the story of reporter Daniel Pearl.
Investigators are pursuing a worldwide hunt to learn if shoe bomb suspect Richard Reed had ties to known terrorists.
The Wall Street Journal's Daniel Pearl was on the Reed story immediately. Pearl traveled to Karachi, Pakistan, the heart of Islamic extremism, with a plan to interview Reed's alleged mentor, Sheikh Jilani. Jilani is an Islamic extremist leader with a following in the U.S. At the Wall Street Journal, Pearl was known for his investigative stories. His writing reflected both his extraordinary curiosity and deep-rooted concern for the world. Pearl's closest friend at the Journal was Robert Frank. He reads a piece of Pearl's writing.
Doha, Qatar. American blues can make you sad. Russian work songs can make you suffer. The fervent belief of many in the Persian Gulf is that pearl diving songs can make you go blind. And it was, again, a classic Danny lead. You just couldn't not read the rest of that story. It was so provocative.
Anti-American sentiment was high in Pakistan as American bombers pounded neighboring Afghanistan. From his base in Bombay, India, Pearl tried to contact Islamic militants to get an interview with the elusive Jilani. After weeks of phone calls, Pearl thought he had a break on the story. A man calling himself Bashir offered to arrange a meeting. Through a sequence of emails, Bashir lured Pearl to Karachi with the promise of an interview with Jilani. Ikram Segal manages a security firm that provides bodyguards.
After some time he said, okay, if I go up outside Karachi, I will request you, but I feel hemmed in.
Pearl decided not to use bodyguards in Karachi, concerned that it might scare off Bashir and Jilani. In Karachi, Pearl and his 6 months pregnant wife, Marianne, stayed with their dear friend and Wall Street Journal colleague, Asra Nomani.
He was getting into the car to go off for his interviews. He was just, Danny. I mean, he was fumbling around with his stuff. It was a beautiful sunny day like today.
It was January 23rd. In between a series of meetings, Pearl phoned Bashir to firm up the Jilani interview for that evening.
Marianne was going to cook this Cuban dish that night. Our plan was then meet for dinner that night. He was going to come back for dinner.
At 6 p.m., Pearl stopped off at the office of Jamil Youssef, a reliable source and criminal investigator.
He came, I met him, and he literally came and sat down over here. He was trying to trace the email of Richard Reed. That's the time he said that Richard Reed had some connection with P. Jilani, and the email was diverted to P. Jilani.
Finally, Bashir confirmed that he had arranged the interview with Jilani.
And then Danny called, at about 6:30 and said that he would be coming home a little bit late, but he was off to go to the interview. And so, we all got dressed up, and Marianne was busy in the kitchen.
He received a phone call on his mobile, on the cell phone, and talking to somebody, he says, yes, I'm very close by, and I will be there at 7 o'clock. And he said he's going to interview P. Jilani.
For his own safety, Pearl arranged to meet Bashir in a public place.
He went at about 7 o'clock to the village restaurant, which is very close from my office. And the car was parked down here where he was asked to meet him.
Then Marianne started calling him about 7:30 just to see how things were going. And I had known from calling Danny before that he never turned his mobile phone off.
After several hours, Asra and Marianne were still unable to reach Pearl on his cell phone.
We went to his laptop to figure out, like, who had he gone to see, and then we started reading the emails from this guy. He described himself as Bashir, who had arranged all of the meetings. We set a mark for ourselves for 2 a.m. If he didn't come back, we'd start calling places. And so that's when we called the Wall Street Journal and the U.S. government.
Pearl's parents, Udaya and Ruth, were at home in Los Angeles.
Marianne called. It was Wednesday night, and she said something bad happened to Danny. He didn't come back last night.
Immediately, the family knew that Pearl's Jewish heritage would heighten his danger. As an American and a Jew, he would be a powerful symbol and the target of hatred for Islamic militants.
And from then on, it was just 24/7, a mission to try to find Danny.
Bashir had been waiting for Pearl at the village restaurant, but Bashir was a phony name. His real name was Sheikh Omar, a notorious Islamic extremist. Sheikh Omar had set a trap for Pearl. His intention from the outset was to capture him. Jelani had been a red herring.
This is the type of car they were using, and it was parked here, and Danny was brought in, and he was taken very comfortably in the car. And there's a guy on the motorbike standing right across on the road, and who was supposed to follow. And he was taken from here straight down, and there was no rush to it.
We immediately realized it was a very dangerous situation.
Kavita Menon, former Asia coordinator for the Committee to Protect Journalists, led CPJ's effort to find Pearl.
They took Danny Pearl to the outskirts of Karachi to a compound that is owned by a man who's linked to the Al Rashid Trust, which has been identified by the U.S. as a charity that does fund militant groups.
Nobody would suspect, no screams would be heard. If you even suspect of an abduction, it's a very quiet and desolate place, very scary to be there at any given time.
Marianne says that she knew from the very beginning that it was Al-Qaeda, you know.
4 days after his kidnapping, U.S. news organizations received photographs of Pearl with a gun against his head. There were also ransom demands, including the release of Pakistani prisoners held at Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, a demand the U.S. government would find impossible to grant. Paul Steiger, managing editor of the Wall Street Journal, led the paper's urgent efforts to attempt to free Pearl.
I tried to communicate to his captors by any means available, encouraging people to make statements supporting his release, and how sympathetic he was to Islam, that their purposes would be best served by releasing him and not harming him.
On February 12th, police arrested Sheikh Omar, the mastermind behind the kidnapping plot, along with 3 accomplices.
The police investigation established it was Sheikh Umar who had picked him up from the roadside restaurant and took him with him.
On February 23rd, Pearl's death was confirmed when a video of his brutal murder was released to the Pakistani police. The FBI arrived at the home of Pearl's parents with the somber news.
One day they came with serious faces, and we understood that the news is bad.
The police investigator told Marianne, you know, I'm sorry, I couldn't bring your Danny home. And those were words that, you know, we were never expecting. I really can't believe it.
I see the note from Steiger and Peter Kahn, and it's, you know, just etched in my brain forever based on information from the U.S. State Department and Pakistani officials. We now believe Danny Pearl has been killed by his captors. And I just kept staring at the email, not believing it and thinking that I misread it and hoping the words were not killed but released by his captors, and my mind was sort of blank. I just couldn't believe it.
On May 18th, U.S. officials finally confirmed they had found Pearl's body. It was excavated from a site on the outskirts of Karachi. Sheikh Omar and the 3 other defendants were tried in a Pakistani court. Raja Qureshi was the prosecutor.
I would say Omar Sheikh's trial was a successful trial, and there was overwhelming evidence. There was judicial confession, which culminated into the death sentence of Omar Sheikh, and the remaining 3 accused were sentenced to life imprisonment.
It was later determined that Jilani was not involved in the kidnapping plot.
Omar Sheikh wanted perhaps an American and a Jew. The video that was released of slaughtering Daniel Pearl, the message to the world was that today the Muslims were trying to slaughter American Jews, which was only to generate sense of fear.
I think the murder of Danny Pearl really made everybody painfully aware of the cost of covering conflicts.
Berkeley journalism dean Orville Schell sees the Pearl murder as a significant shift. Today, journalists are seen as symbolizing the countries they report for.
Now, in Danny Pearl's case, the fact that he was Jewish probably was identification that fatally played into what happened to him.
U.S. authorities say they have in custody others involved in this plot. They now believe Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, the alleged mastermind behind September 11th, actually wielded the sword that killed Pearl. As the investigations continue, friends of Pearl say that they are determined to keep his memory alive for his son and for everyone who works as a journalist.
You know, I see him in his son. I really see the twinkle in his eye when Adam laughs. I can really feel Danny's presence. There must be a continuum between life and death, because that's how it feels. I mean, it doesn't feel like there was just an end to his life with this death.
Rather than silencing him or what he believed in, the terrorists have actually made what he stood for stronger. The pursuit of truth by journalists around the world, they've made that stronger. For all of the horror that this has brought on us, we take comfort that that legacy has become stronger.
Udea and Ruth Pearl keep their son's memory alive with the Daniel Pearl Foundation, which promotes cross-cultural understanding through journalism and music.
That's how I would like him to be remembered, with a head high, determined, disciplined, and playful at the same time.
By March 2002, 2 more journalists are dead. When we come back, we travel to the West Bank town of Ramallah, where an experienced photojournalist suddenly finds himself part of the story. When you work in a war zone as a journalist, you know the risks. You mark your car in bold letters, wear bulletproof vests if you have them. You try to avoid taking chances. Instincts and experience are essential, but there are no guarantees. Here's legendary CBS newsman Walter Cronkite with the story of Rafael Ciriello.
Each year, 800 foreign journalists descend on the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, making the Palestinian-Israeli conflict the world's most reported. March 2002, at the age of 42, Italian photojournalist Rafael Ciriello made his first trip to the region. He traveled there with reporter Amedeo Ricucci, a man he had worked with in Somalia.
Usually, war photographers can be arrogant and conceited people with too much self-confidence. He was instead very humble. He had taken pictures of the Italian and American troops in Mogadishu. He then gave them each a print. Photojournalists never do this.
Ciriello traded an affluent life as a surgeon to follow his heart and chronicle world troubles as a combat photographer. His wife, Paola, says he never regretted the decision.
He started to take pictures at a very young age. Actually, he won a competition while at school. He fell in love with photography during his university years while he was studying medicine.
He hoped to bring to the world's attention the suffering inflicted by war. Since 1992, Ciriello traveled the world for months at a time.
We were accustomed to stay apart for a while. I was more concerned about when he was in Afghanistan and stayed without talking for a month.
March 13, 2002, Ciriello was in Ramallah covering the Palestinian conflict for Corriere della Sera, an Italian daily newspaper.
From Palestine, he called me a lot, so I was more relaxed.
Fighting had been going on in Ramallah for 3 days. Both Ciriello and Rakucci had video cameras, and what follows are the pictures that were recorded as events tragically unfolded.
All the city was overwhelmed by a strange silence. All of a sudden, close to the center of Ramallah, we heard some voices. We ran into a group of Palestinian fighters.
They were about half a mile from a refugee camp where the fighting was taking place.
All of a sudden, a soldier who was with us stepped forward and fired a few shots with his gun. I tried to see what he was shooting at. It was a tank. I filmed it. But I wasn't scared, since we never had problems with Israeli tanks.
But today would be different.
After a few minutes, Raphael also leaned out to see the tank.
Ciriello kept his camera rolling.
Everything was sudden. Raphael was put in the car. We went to the hospital. The doctors told us that the situation wasn't good. They operated on him, but in vain. I think that the soldier who shot Raphael had already decided to shoot whoever was about to lean out.
The Israeli army investigated the incident. It concluded that they had no evidence and no knowledge of an army force that fired in the direction of the photographer. That they had declared Ramallah a closed military zone at the time, and that journalists entering zones where fire is exchanged are jeopardizing themselves knowingly and at their own responsibility.
The emptiness grows heavy. You're alone. A piece of my life has gone. I felt I was torn. I couldn't have prevented him from doing it. It was his life, part of his nature.
Ciriello's images remain on his website, Postcards from Hell. Here his memory and his message of peace is kept alive by his friends.
In April 2002, according to the Committee to Protect Journalists, 4 reporters have been killed in Venezuela, Colombia, India, and Russia. In just 4 months, 8 journalists have died. On May 13th, journalists and radio listeners in the Philippines hear a news they will never forget. National Public Radio's Ann Garrels tells the story of Edgar Damalario.
In 1986, a populist democratic movement in the Philippines swept corrupt dictator Ferdinand Marcos out of power and ushered in an era of freedom. But the country remains a fledgling democracy and one of the deadliest places in the world for journalists. Since 1986, 33 journalists have been killed and no arrests have been made. It was in this environment that 28-year-old entrepreneur and idealist Edgar Damalario decided to shut down his profitable computer business and embark on a life as a journalist. In addition to doing radio and television commentary, Damalario went to work for one of the many grassroots newspapers that had sprung up. His paper, the Zamboanga Scribe, operates out of a storefront with a staff of 8. For 3 years, Hernan de la Cruz published Damalario's work in the Zamboanga Scribe.
There is one point which I love this profession because of its noble mission to be the watchdog of the government, to be the voice of the people. I believe that Edgar has a similar thinking and understanding as the way I have.
The Scribe is based in the port city of Pagadian on the island of Mindanao. A complex mix of urban and rural life and notorious for its lawlessness. Damolario's reporting angered powerful people in the community. He accused the vice mayor of profiteering and purchasing overpriced transportation. He criticized Police Superintendent Hawani for his failure to curb illegal drugs, and the governor for trying to shut down a hospital expansion only because it was funded by a political rival. Most journalists in the Philippines steer clear of these stories, knowing all too well they could get killed. Melinda Quintos de Jesus championed Damolario's case in the media.
He was seen as an outstanding young reporter. He had the kind of impact of somebody who was not afraid to call the shots.
In 1998, Damolario married Gemma, and their son Edgar Joshua was born in 2001.
What attracted me to Edgar was his goodness, his capacity to understand, and his generosity in helping people in need.
April 19, 2002. Damolario exposed a local electrical company that failed to account for $1 million allocated to projects never completed. He questioned whether this money had lined the pockets of corrupt politicians. In a recent column in The Scribe, he wrote a stinging expose of police racketeering. Publisher Hernan de la Cruz.
The last time that he talked to me was about on the allegations also that a top police official was protecting illegal drugs and illegal gambling, and behind the spate of killings and carnappings in the city.
Damolario received death threats. Anonymous callers phoned the Scribe and his home, warning him they would get him. May 13, 2002, 7:30 p.m. Damolario was driving home with his friends from a press conference.
Nagtawag siya sa kuha. He called me because I sent him a message saying, "Watch out, because there are suspicious men outside our house." So he said, "Okay, just lock up. I'm on my way home now."
But his attackers had set a trap, and he soon became aware he was being followed as well. His friend and colleague Edgar Amoro was traveling with him.
So immediately we turned our eyes left side, the three of us, and there we saw that single motor with two persons riding on it.
Edgar Onge was also in the car.
Ako di ari ko.
Here's where Edgar Amoro sat. Then I was here. And here's where Edgar Damolario was.
Marlon Toledo directed the inquiry for the National Bureau of Investigation.
This is where the incident happened. As the vehicle of Edgar Damolario was passing by this area, the assailant came on board a motorcycle, and as he passed by just at the side of Damolario, pulled out his gun.
This is where it hit, the first shot.
Hitting him at the left side of his armpit, hitting his heart and his lungs, causing his instantaneous death.
Being with Damolario, who was hit, I was shocked and I couldn't move. I froze because I saw Damolario was already shaking because he was hit. I was scared because the gunman came back and asked, "Who's this? Who's this?" while we were holding Edgar Damolario's body. We didn't say anything because he was the one who shot at us.
Amoro sent a text message to Gemma to tell her Edgar had been shot.
After I received the message, I became somewhat unconscious. I didn't understand how or what I was feeling. But after a few minutes, when I came back to full consciousness, I realized that the very thing we feared had finally happened, that he was killed.
The witnesses positively identified the killer. He was not a gangster. He was a well-known local police officer, Guillermo Wapili. But capturing him was not simple.
Actually, before the warrant of arrest was given to Wapili, he was supposed to be confined to the provincial command. But when the arrest warrant was released by the court, it was sad to note that Wapili was nowhere to be found.
He had been in the custody of his own department, but mysteriously he managed to escape. Lynn Newman, who covers Asia for the CPJ, brought the case to a world audience.
Clearly this guy Wapili is being protected by some powerful people, and that is outrageous.
Superintendent Godofredo Mendoza de los Santos has been the provincial director of the Pagadian Police since February 2003.
I don't see anything difficult for journalists to be afraid in the city of Pagadian. The case of Wapili and the malaria is just an isolated case.
But the facts tell a different story. 2 journalists have been killed in the past 2 years in Pagadian City alone.
This is chapter and verse of what's wrong with the justice system in the Philippines, and chapter and verse of why murders of people like Edgar frequently go unpunished.
But Gemma de Malario, along with the 2 witnesses, turned up the pressure on corrupt police officials and her husband's murderer.
These are people who stand to get a bullet in the head for testifying in court, and yet now for many, many months they've been willing to come forward and put themselves on the line for this.
The case illustrated the possibility of actually getting somebody indicted in court because witnesses came forward and the killer was identified.
Now the witnesses and his colleague are in grave danger. De la Cruz carries a gun and is flanked by heavily armed bodyguards.
I still believe that having an escort and having guns is not a guarantee of your security.
Ready to fire.
And in fact, it has ethical question for journalists carrying guns.
Meanwhile, Gemma de Malario's life is also in danger. She lives in hiding and returned to Pagadian only to champion her husband's cause.
Sukad sa pagkamatay ni Edgar.
Since Edgar's death, a lot has changed. The whole family is not here in Pagadian anymore. We had to move because of all the harassments and threats.
Both Amoro and Onge, the friends of de Malario and witnesses to his murder, live in constant fear for their lives. Charged but never arrested, Wapili remains free and on the run. Despite all the fear and intimidation, the fight for justice for de Malario is now a celebrated cause in the Philippines.
Ang iyang trabaho gyud.
His job was a really big risk for our whole family. I already talked to him about it early on because I, for one, was really scared. But he just responded, I already offered my life to this country. Who else would start this, especially if we know of their unjust deeds? We really have to fight for what is right. I don't have any fear of dying anymore.
After de Malario's death, journalist Navaraj Sharma was murdered in Nepal, the 10th to die since January. When we come back, we'll take you to Brazil, to the slums of Rio, where one intrepid journalist meets an unthinkable end. In the first 6 months of 2002, 10 journalists died in the line of duty. In June, a Brazilian reporter who routinely exposed corruption and government misdeeds finds himself a target. ABC World News Tonight anchor Peter Jennings brings us the story of Tim Lopez.
To much of the world, the image of Brazil is the 24-hour party known as Carnival. But the front page of Rio's daily newspapers tell a very different story of drugs and guns and prostitution. In August of 2001, on TV Globo, Brazil's largest television network, there was a program called Drug Party. The program documented the unchecked drug sales, crime, and prostitution in Rio's favelas, the slums, a story dangerous to capture on television. The reporter, Tim Lopez, smuggled a camera into the crime-infested favelas, home to 1 in 5 of Rio's population, and they are run by the drug lords. Tim Lopez was the 4th child of a police lieutenant and a teacher. The family of 12 lived in a 3-room shanty. Lopez's sister Tanya and his brother Miro went back to their childhood home.
From an early age, Tim was concerned about the children in the neighborhood who had less than we had. Once he brought a little boy home and told my mother to feed him. This boy ate with us for 15 years.
Growing up in the favelas gave Lopez a sense of mission. He hoped to reduce the level of inequality in Brazil.
Ele chorava às vezes.
He would cry sometimes, feeling sad about the things he had seen. But he had no rage, because when he set to write, he believed he was doing his work, and that his investigation would change the world.
Sandra Quintelia is the mother of Lopez's son, Bruno.
I met Tim in a party. Everybody wanted to dance with him, because he was a great dancer. He danced with all the women in the party. He was the party.
They were together for 10 years and they continue to be great friends. Lopez's stories revealed the dirty world beneath Rio's glitter. He documented the city's rat-infested kitchens. He told the stories of the street children addicted to inhaling glue and the drug party named Rio's most ruthless criminals. Lopez made himself powerful enemies. The report presented the favelas as lawless and drug-ridden, which they were, and it accused the government of ceding control to the drug dealers. The impact was immediate. It galvanized opposition to the drug dealers, it challenged politicians, and it won Lopez Brazil's top prize for journalism. He was now in very great danger. Nassif Elias Sobrinho, president of the Journalists Union, said Lopez was the only hope that Rio's poor had.
Tim Lopez was called because there was no one to hear their problem. The community told the police many times and nothing was done.
On the day in question, Lopez left his wallet, his cell phone, and his dress shirt in his office at TV Globo. Cesar Seabra was Lopez's boss for 7 years.
He was doing a story about the funk dance parties in Rio de Janeiro. There, dealers sold drugs and promoted child prostitution in the poor communities.
From the television studio, Lopez went to a local mall where he was rigged with a hidden camera. Inspector Daniel Gomez of Rio's Civil Police.
Tim Lopez left towards the Villa Cruzeiro. It was very dangerous work because Tim Lopez, as a crime reporter, was entering this place without telling the police or any security organization.
Lopez went into the favelas wired and unarmed, believing that he could operate safely.
Most of the journalists working at Globo's office are middle class. Only a few people live like Tim used to live, in the favelas.
When Inspector Gomez recreates what happened that night, he went into the favelas with 12 heavily armed military policemen.
He came to this bar and he bought a beer. And from here, he came back to this piece of concrete. He was filming all the drug dealers over there, selling cocaine and passing by on motorcycles with guns.
A little boy had approached Lopez at a bar. Lopez did not know the boy was the lookout for a drug dealer.
This was the place where he was captured. Shortly after his capture, he was taken to one of the alleys where he was tied. Then, Elias the madman was contacted at the Grotto slum, and the order was given that a car would come to pick him up.
Without a weapon or a phone, Lopez was helpless. His captors shot him in both legs and then put him into the trunk of a Fiat. Gomez and his entourage drive the same route that the injured Lopez was taking.
Isso aqui na madrugada, o horário em que Tim Lopes foi capturado à noite.
Over that opening, Tim Lopez was tortured. Over there is a sports field. This is the sign the drug dealers give to warn each other that there are policemen around.
The police reported that Elias, the madman, and his gang conducted a mock trial and sentenced Lopez to death.
They brought him over this valley around 2 in the morning and took his life. Here, Tim Lopez was cruelly beaten and his legs were cut with a samurai sword.
Overnight, Lopez went from byline to headline. On June the 10th, 2002, after their arrest on other charges, 2 of the gang members confessed to the murder.
Here, after being burned, his body was smashed with a sharp object. You can still see the marks over here on the stone. kidnapped, judged, tortured, executed Tim Lopez.
A month later, police found Lopez's remains. Only his rib bone, plus his watch, a crucifix, and his hidden camera.
The death of Tim Lopez opened our eyes to a new reality. Now our dilemma is to figure out how to report stories from the neighborhoods controlled by the drug dealers.
Seabra says the culture of crime reporting must change.
We're tired of giving the criminals the front page. We're tired of interviewing the criminal on TV. We're tired of empowering the criminal in order to get an exclusive.
On September the 19th, 2002, Elias, the madman, was arrested.
This is Elias the madman, the boss of the drug trade. At the moment he is arrested, waiting to be sentenced for this crime.
His trial date is set for March 2004. For the Committee to Protect Journalists Ann Cooper, Lopez's story has had impact around the world.
Freedom of the press, having an independent media, some other source of news besides the government, is so important to any democracy. When a journalist is killed, like Tim Lopez in Brazil, that can have a very chilling effect on all of the media in the country.
Now, 1 year later, Lopez's family is trying to mend its broken spirit and find the strength to go on.
My son asked me what could he do for his father. I said, use the weapons your father used to use. Use the words.
After Tim Lopez's murder, over the next 10 months, according to the Committee to Protect Journalists, 29 more reporters have lost their lives, an average of 3 per month. Keep in mind, this is before hostilities in Iraq have even begun. When we return, David Bloom, a fixture in America's living rooms, on the front lines with U.S. troops. On March 20th, 2003, the long simmering tensions between the U.S. and Saddam Hussein break out into full-blown conflict. Journalists from around the world move in to cover the fighting. Some are embedded with U.S. and British troops. Others remain on their own. Here's NBC nightly news anchor Tom Brokaw with the story of his friend and colleague, David Bloom.
It was the eve of the war in Iraq. The U.S. military mobilized tens of thousands of troops into Kuwait. Hundreds of reporters embedded with U.S. military units so they could report from the front lines.
This is the U.S. Army's 3rd Infantry Division.
David Bloom was a colleague and a friend. Everyone at NBC knew that he was a rising star at the network.
David, we'll see you soon. Please stay safe.
Thanks a lot. We're looking forward to getting back home.
Bloom's friend and NBC News correspondent, Kerry Sanders.
Even as David became the anchor at NBC News on the Weekend Today, every story he did, he was excited to make sure that he was discovering something new, and he wanted you to come right along with him.
Bloomy was just a bundle of enthusiasm and passion for what he did.
Richard Liebner, Bloom's agent and friend.
If you talked with David, if you worked with David, he had to get under your skin. You had to plug into him. He was just so warm and so involved.
The war in Iraq was the biggest story of Bloom's life, and he reported it in a new way.
We're with the 2nd Brigade, the 315 Infantry. They were the first unit from this division to enter into southern Iraq last night.
Bob Woodruff of ABC News was David's close friend.
What he did with his Bloommobile was something that had never been done before, which was he was able to go live on a real broadband satellite constantly while he was moving through the desert.
Bloom and his Bloommobile on-the-move reports brought the war into the American living room.
If I can ask my photographer, Craig White, to pan forward here, you can see just a cloud of dust, but that's dozens of tanks and Bradley fighting vehicles moving through the desert of south-central Iraq.
Bloom, a man who truly loved his wife and children, spared no effort to stay in constant touch with his 3 daughters, Christine, Ava, and Nicole, and his wife, Melanie. Melanie Bloom reads one of David's emails to his 9-year-old, Nicole.
And yes, my dear sweet girl, when I'm a little bit scared,
I promise you I will remember you and your sisters and your mom, and I will know in my heart just how much you love me, to the moon and back, right?
Bloom made sure that he was in the center of the action.
Tom, we're under attack right now.
The danger of combat and difficult desert conditions weren't the only problems.
We all slept with our legs up in the air, our legs pulled up to our chests. I mean, it was horribly uncomfortable. Dave, was doing the same thing. We were dehydrated, stressed, we were cramped.
By April 2, 2003, the 3rd Infantry Division drove to within several hundred miles of Baghdad. Bloom's cameraman, Craig White.
He complained of what he thought was a pulled muscle. Later that day, we walked over to a medic and we got some ibuprofen for a little bit of the pain and didn't think too much of it.
April 4th, 2 days later.
David called his doctor. The doctor said that, well, you could just have a pulled muscle, but it could be something much more serious. And if that's the case, it's a blood clot formed in the leg, and that can be life-threatening. So you really ought to seek some medical attention.
This sandstorm has been pounding these troops here in the
I think it would have taken 2 very large WWE wrestlers to get him off the Bloomobile.
And David knew that probably our best chance to get out of Iraq was maybe a day and a half in advance from Baghdad airport. As we get closer to Baghdad, bodies started to pile up. Blood would run across the roads. We knew what happened to Jessica Lynch and the people who were executed. So David started to come face to face with the fact that you could die out there.
It was April 5. Bloom, as usual, was more concerned about others than himself.
He called me, and he just said to the person on the desk, try to patch me through to Bob. And they said, well, we can't get hold of him right now. And he said, well, just tell him to take care of himself and keep his head down.
He just found out a couple hours ago that his wife Erica had a baby about 2 weeks or so ago. So I'm going to give this headset to him and let him talk to his wife here.
I woke the morning of April 6th, and David, he said, I found out last night we're leaving. We're going into Baghdad. We're going in about an hour. So he was very heartened when he found out that we were on our way to Baghdad.
The up-close experience of death transformed Bloom. As he did so many times, he poured out his heart to his wife Melanie in an email.
Here I am, supposedly at the peak of professional success, and I could frankly care less. Yes, I'm proud of the good job we've all been doing, but in the scheme of things, it matters little compared to my relationship with you and the girls and Jesus.
Then, things started to happen rapidly.
And then I saw someone horizontal in the dirt. And I looked over, looked again, and it was David. And I ran over and saw David slightly up on one elbow with a dazed look on his face. Immediately, I yelled, medic! We got an IV in him. I held him by the hand, by the arm. He looked up at me, and his pupils just dilated out and fixed.
Several hours later, in the midst of a battle just outside of Baghdad, Bloom's unit received the terrible news.
The sergeant sitting in front of me on the M88, I remember him ripping up his helmet and just yelling, oh God! And I knew what it was. He reached his hand back to me, and I grabbed his hand and bit my lip and fought back the tears, and it was real. David was gone.
When I called in to my wife, who gave me the news, was about as shocking of a thing as I'd ever heard. I said to my wife, what do you mean he passed away? You don't pass away in a war. You're either killed or you live. Was he shot? She said, no, he had some kind of embolism. You know, it didn't make sense to me.
I was prepared for a bullet or a bomb, but not this.
And just to watch his eyes, his pupils dilate out and fix, it's an image that's haunted me. I can't get rid of it. It's awakened me in the middle of the night. I'll never forget it.
There was a much larger...
There's no question in my mind that Dave died because of the combat that was happening around him. You know, he was not going to die of an embolism if he were covering the White House. He died of an embolism because he was covering war.
I find it hard to accept that David did not come home.
Yes, we consider David one of our own and part of our ranks.
And I believe the biggest thing that impressed me about David is he lived the life of our soldiers here on the battlefield. Task force! Attention! Present!
The loss of David Bloom affected many of us deeply, but his passing devastated his family. His last email demonstrates what an extraordinary human being and friend and father David Bloom was.
When the moment comes in my life when you are talking about my last days, I am determined that they will say he was devoted to his wife and children, and he gave every ounce of his being, not for himself, but for those whom he cared about most, God and his family. Save this note. Look at it a month from now, a year from now, 10 years from now, 20 years from now. I love you, and I know that you love me. Please give the girls a big hug, squeeze them tight, and let them know just how much their daddy loves and cares for them. With love and devotion, Dave.
David Bloom is the 41st journalist to die since January 2002. He is not the last. When we return, friendly fire and Baghdad's Palestine hotel. There's no doubt that covering a war presents a unique set of challenges. In the conflict with Iraq, some reporters were embedded with the U.S. military or British forces. Others remained unilateral. A number of international journalists stayed in Baghdad throughout the war, many living in the city's Palestine hotel. CNN's Christiane Amanpour takes up the story.
April 8, 2003, U.S. forces were fighting their way into Baghdad. Ukrainian cameraman Taras Protsiak of Reuters news service was filming the action from the balcony of the 15th floor of the Palestine hotel. Joel Campagna of the Committee to Protect Journalists, the CPJ.
Several journalists who were in the Palestine hotel had been monitoring a very intense battle around the Tigris River, in which U.S. forces, a tank battalion, had engaged with Iraqi forces and battled alongside the Jumhuriya bridge. And journalists had been watching this from the comfort of their balconies on the Palestine hotel.
Approximately 150 journalists were staying at the hotel. They saw 2 U.S. tanks across the river.
Some U.S. commanders on the ground had been aware of the presence of journalists in the hotel. A U.S. commander had been frantically trying to determine the exact location of the Palestine hotel so that an airstrike he was about to call in would not harm journalists in the hotel.
U.S. military officials first tried to say they were not aware that Palestine was full of journalists, and they also claimed that hostile fire was coming from the hotel. But news organizations with staff at the Palestine had given the Pentagon its precise coordinates before the war began, and journalists there insist that no one was firing from their hotel. This is the account the U.S. battalion gave to NBC cameraman Craig White after the attack.
From the angle, they weren't sure that it was the Palestine. They knew someone was directing the fire. As they looked up into this high building, they saw a person with binoculars and a walkie-talkie. Every time they would change direction and move, the binoculars came down, the walkie-talkie came up.
Paul Holmes, editor at Reuters.
One of the 2 tanks fired a tank round. It hit some lattice work on the outside of the 14th floor, and Taras was killed by shrapnel.
And they very mistakenly thought that 2 journalists were spotters for the Iraqis.
Protsiak is survived by his wife and 8-year-old son. Spanish cameraman Jose Cozo was also killed in that attack. He leaves behind 2 young children. The CPJ conducted an investigation into the incident. It concludes the attack was not deliberate, but could have been avoided. It blames bad communication. The U.S. Department of Defense conducted its own internal review, but despite repeated requests, has not made the full report public. A short news release concluded that the tank unit acted in a, quote, proportionate and justifiably measured response. But it never explained why U.S. commanders who knew the Palestine was full of journalists failed to make that clear to their forces on the ground.
Proziuk, Ciriello, Damalario, Lopez, Bloom, Pearl. 6 out of 46 journalists who died in one 15-month period. It's debatable whether any story is worth dying for, but some stories are worth fighting for. And these men and women were doing just that, fighting to tell stories they cared deeply about. Of each, it can be said they died doing what they believed in, and what they believed in was truth, finding it, reporting it, sacrificing for it. I'm not sure their friends and families would be so quick to say the sacrifice was worth it, but these journalists chose the way they lived their lives, not the way they lost them. What they did and died doing is worth remembering, because what they did and died doing brings honor to us all. I'm Anderson Cooper.